Hi, I'm Georgi, this is Tomasz, and you're listening to Rebase, podcast covering the stories behind open source projects. Today we have Christoph Nakazawa with us. Hi, Christoph.
Hey, how's it going?
Hello. So Christoph, on the software side, what do you do when you don't program? What do you do as hobbies?
Probably more programming. No, I love hanging out at the beach or on a mountain to do snowboarding, like all these sort of things like hiking, outdoor sports. Unfortunately, I don't get to do that much of it recently because I'm programming.
You live in Japan, and I haven't heard about any Japanese beaches. Are there nice beaches?
Yeah, beautiful beaches and beautiful islands.
Nice. I hope I will visit sometime. Let's get started with the main agenda. We invited you here because you are behind some important open source projects. We will get to it. But maybe before we get there, how did you start with open source software? How contributions? What were the first moments?
Mm-hmm. I started coding when I was 12 years old, so that was like 23 years ago. And so I've been coding for like 2/3 of my life, almost, I guess. And I wanted to start coding because I wanted to build like video games and like social experiences. I discovered the internet and I just thought it was this powerful ecosystem where anyone can build anything and just share it with people instantly. You know, you don't have to download anything. There are no like viruses, like these sort of things. And it was so powerful that at the time you could like go on any website and like right click and view source and see exactly how that thing was built. So it was very easy to like figure out how to build certain things by just looking at how somebody else did it. And that's something that's like not as easy today as it was back then. And pretty early on when I was like just coding and like learning how to code by like looking at what other people did, I found this book by Linus Torvalds. It was called Just for Fun. And it was just so interesting how he thought he could build something better than his professor at university and just give it away for free. And I thought that idea was so powerful. And when you look at Linux now, it's basically powering almost all computing in the world, right? Or if it's not directly powering like a computer, like a lot of ideas from that computer are powering it, right? And like even Windows ships with like a part of like Linux inside of it now. It's absolutely incredible. And you know, you can think of Linus Torvalds what you will, like, you know, he's a divisive figure and sometimes pretty rude, which is personally, I think, not really a path to success in open source. It seems to work for him, but that like just the idea of open source and like giving things away for free that you create, I just believe in the power of how that can compound and like, you know, help human progress. And so it was pretty early on. I was like 14 or 15 when I read that book, and it was just so powerful. And that's pretty quickly after that, I started like, you know, building JavaScript libraries or small things, or like trying to join other JavaScript communities to do open source and just give away everything for free.
Mm-hmm. I think it's pretty much only Linus Torvalds that can get away with being rude to people that he works with. What was the first community you joined?
That was the MooTools community, and that was pretty fun. So MooTools was one of the part of the first generation of JavaScript frameworks. So among Prototype.js, jQuery, Dojo, there was also MooTools. And I just really loved the idea behind it. I was a teenager. I wasn't like that good at coding, but MooTools was set up to be for the intermediate to advanced JavaScript developer. And that kind of just spoke to me because I thought, oh, I'm like an advanced JavaScript developer. And even though, you know, I think at the time nobody was really an advanced JavaScript developer, but that's kind of, you know, as a teenager, I thought highly of myself, which, you know, is maybe funny now in hindsight. But I just really liked that developer community and the ideas behind that framework. So I just started using it for all the projects I was building. I was building like a social network. I was building a video game, and like I was building those all like with web technologies, with using MooTools. And then pretty quickly I started making changes to MooTools and then started contributing to it. And so that was like the first like major open source project that I worked on with, and like I met a lot of people, both in Europe and in the US, and many of them later on ended up joining Facebook, where I also worked for about 10 years.
I think we'll get to it. But I would like to hang out with MooTools a little bit, since I remember when I was predominantly backend engineer, when I had to work on a project which involves some JavaScript and I was doing research, I found MooTools, and actually I liked it better than jQuery. But unfortunately, I was overvoted by the team at the time who preferred jQuery. So we ended up using jQuery. How would you compare these two? And why do you think jQuery became so much more dominant than, let's say, MooTools?
I think it was not down to the technology at all at the time. So the major difference was that MooTools, we decided that it's better to augment like the native JavaScript types. So add methods to array, to string, to like basically everything, put them into the global scope and just kind of make it feel like you're writing native JavaScript, as if you don't have a library. But, at the time we didn't have Babel or any syntax compilers. So like do whatever we could do with the syntax that we're given in JavaScript and provide something that feels like this is what JavaScript should be within the constraints that we have. And all the other libraries, they opted to provide like a single kind of like global object. That was before there were module systems. There was no common JS that only started coming around in like 2011. Node was, I think, initially released in 2009, 2010. CommonJS was formalized then. And ECMAScript modules were only a thing like 5 or 6 years after that. And so all these other libraries, they were like, here's like one single global, and like we don't augment, we don't touch the environment around us. We protect against that. And the API is like maybe worse, but then when browsers started moving and like building new JavaScript features into the browser, the approach that MooTools took was kind of problematic. But aside from that, that's something we could have worked with. But aside from that, I think the whole branding of like, hey, MooTools is for the intermediate to advanced developer, that's, I think, where it started to go wrong. It was kind of very idealistic. And back then, we didn't have Prettier. So we were like, the code style has to be perfect. And, this library, every single line of code has to be perfect. And so we were all kind of very idealistic. I was still a teenager. Many other folks that worked on it were like teenagers or in their early like 20s. And so it's much more about like, let's build like the perfect JavaScript library. And we put very little care into managing a community, making it beginner friendly, writing documentation, like all those sort of things. And there were some other folks in the team that were like, hey, we should do all those things, but they were kind of overruled by us more idealistic folks, which, in hindsight, I would say was totally wrong of us. And, a lot of folks on that team learned a lot that we took onto the projects that we worked on in the future. So we made a lot of learnings, and we probably didn't manage the project in the right way to make it more successful. So I think that's one of the key reasons and key learnings from that time.
Mm-hmm. I would compare MooTools versus jQuery to like VHS and that other format that didn't win but was better, or DVD versus that other format didn't win but was better. This is how I view MooTools from the outside, that it made much more sense to me when I was using it back in the days. But at the end, everyone just ended up using jQuery. And I guess you think the reason is that you didn't build the community around it properly. Mm-hmm. Nice.
And even today, jQuery has still 10.5 million downloads every week on NPM.
That's probably the reason of legacy reason of those websites still have it, right? Nobody probably chooses jQuery nowadays.
Yep, makes sense. So you mentioned that maybe half of the team ended up in Facebook. How did it look like? Did Facebook hire one of the person and they kind of referred all the others, or how was this kind of move?
Yeah, I think more or less that's kind of how it worked out. So it was Tom Okino. He was my manager for the longest time at Facebook. He was also my intern manager because I was actually, Facebook approached me for a full-time position, but I was still at university and I was like, hey, do you have any internships available? And then somehow within like a month, they made it work for me to like do the interviews, get the visa to go to the US. Like as far as I know, normally, or later on, I also started hiring interns for Facebook. Usually that process starts in like October, November, concludes in like maybe January, February, and everybody knows what they're doing in the summer. I was reached out to in like late April and late March. And then we wrapped it all up by late April. And then my internship started in like the first week of June. And like, I'm pretty sure like some folks pulled some strings to make that work. Like, I'm pretty sure there was no internship position available at that point anymore, but somehow they made it work. So I was like the second kind of person from MooTools to join. And then a bunch of other folks like Sebastian Markbarke, who is still tech leading React, not at Facebook anymore, now at Vercel. He joined Facebook, and like 4 to 5 other folks, and some of them are still there, still working on like various technologies around React. And so it was pretty awesome to find this community as a teenager, and like as a teenager, I didn't even think I would ever end up at like a company like Facebook. Like it might have been a distant dream, but I'm from Austria, so I never even imagined moving to the US, or, like the dream would be to visit the US once in your lifetime. And then it's pretty crazy to end up like actually living there permanently. And so it was pretty cool to work so closely and become friends and like, literally sit in an office with people every day that you met as a teenager on the internet through like a open source library.
I bet it must have been cool.
It sounds like Facebook was kind of targeting people that were doing open source back at the day. Was there some kind of tactics to kind of hire these people into the Facebook? The same thing with you, where they gave you the short notice on the internship and all of this stuff. So yeah, was that some deliberate tactic by Facebook to hire these kind of folks?
Maybe. I mean, I wasn't involved in the hiring process at that point in time because it was like just when I had started. I was heavily involved afterwards. At that time, I think, the JavaScript community was so much smaller that like the only way you get to find people that you want to hire into those positions are those that are already like popular in the open source community, because most other people, they're not doing front end or not exclusively front end, right? And so Facebook definitely looked out for those folks and like who could fit into Facebook that like works on that. So I think, the recruiters definitely figured out, whoever is on that MooTools developers list, we should probably like reach out to them at least, and a bunch of them, like they were like, it was like kind of baiting a fish, and like a bunch of them, like they took the bait, which was pretty good bait. Not gonna lie. So yeah, I think it was just the JavaScript community was so much smaller than it is now.
So what did you start working on after you joined Facebook?
Yeah, so when I was an intern, I worked on JavaScript testing, interestingly. That was way before Jest, but I also on MooTools, I had some strong opinions about testing. I just tried to... my experience was always that if the testing frameworks are not good, people won't write any tests. And then you end up with like all these bugs and issues. So at Facebook, I came in and like there was also this internal JavaScript framework. It was open source, and it was like taking some ideas of MooTools, even like it's actually super hilarious. Like if you look it up on the web archive. So that framework was called Javelin, and it was also open source. And it was this thing that it was like one of the earliest like front-end technologies that Facebook open sourced. And I spent some time working on that as well. And it was mostly built for the mobile side. And then the team attempted to make it work for Facebook.com as well. And so it had almost no documentation, and it made 100% sense for Facebook at the time, so late 2009, 2010, but it didn't really make sense in open source. And so the most hilarious thing is that they took the MooTools text of like, this framework is for the intermediate to advanced user, and it has like, robust, beautiful APIs or something. And they used that text, that paragraph, and put it on the Javelin website, but they turned everything into opposites. So it sounded super hilarious. You should look it up in the web archive. It was like Javelin.js. And it's like really funny, and like a lot of people got that joke. Not everyone did, but it was pretty good. So I worked on that. But then later on, I was like, for a brief time, I was a contractor because after the internship, I got a job offer from Facebook, but I had to go back to Austria to finish my degree so that I could get a visa to move to the US. So I was a contractor for a while, and I worked mostly on like random UI tasks. And I think, I didn't know it at the time, but I was sitting in Austria working for Facebook, and I think they just gave me that opportunity to really like try to hire me, because it's like you get an offer, this person has to leave the country, finish the degree. And so their idea was like, hey, if we like allow him to be a contractor, maybe he'll, or it's more likely that he'll come back full time. Because at the time, I honestly didn't know. It was like, I didn't even think I could get a job offer after this internship. Normally, Facebook has like a 6-week bootcamp program where you like figure out which team you're going to join at the end. And I graduated within 3 weeks to join that same team that I was on to work on JavaScript infrastructure. So I was pretty lucky that the folks that I worked with during my internship, they were all still there, and they all wanted to work with me on this team. So briefly, I worked on React, but for me, I just thought, even though it was like 2013, which is like 11 years ago now, I thought React was pretty much done. Like, I just thought that whatever I can add to React is like not like major impact from what I want to do. So I worked on React briefly just to get an idea. Then I worked on Relay and also JavaScript server rendering. So everything at Facebook is using PHP or Hack, like it was like a evolved version of PHP. But then we started building React and Relay, which is like a data fetching library for GraphQL. And we wanted to rebuild the mobile site using those technologies, using front-end technologies. But at the time, we still had to figure out how to do server rendering. So I probably built the first real like server rendering engine for React internally at Facebook as well, using Node.js and the VM module and all that. And then I worked on Relay, as I said. And then from that, I jumped onto code mods because the problem was we had this really, I don't know if anyone remembers, but at the time, React had classes. But it wasn't like ES 2015 or ES6 classes. It was React.create class. And the interesting thing is that was very similar to MooTools' class.create pattern. It's like almost the same, for like defining a React component. And so that system also had mix-ins where you could mix in like different functionality into multiple different React components. So traits in like other languages, which is also extremely similar to MooTools classes. They also had mix-ins and extensions and like all those things, even before all these things were like patterns in like JS. Well, mix-ins never have become because they're like complicated to work with. So it was very like MooTools like syntax. And I think Tom Okino and a bunch of other folks are like responsible for that early React syntax. But we were like building Relay and we had this Relay GraphQL mix-in that brought all this Relay functionality in. And then we discussed that was not a good approach and wouldn't work with like ES 2015 class components and wouldn't work with like how React was evolving. And so we had like hundreds of these like Relay components where we were mixing in those features. And we were like, we came up with this concept of higher order components. And so that's something that's like used to be really popular. It's not popular now, but like I, together with the team, built like the first like higher order component. Like it didn't exist in open source as a thing at that time. So I built this like Relay GraphQL container or whatever it was. But then how do you migrate 200, 300 like class, like React components to this new system? And then a coworker of mine, Felix Kling, he had this thing where we were already using like all these complicated AST transforms. We were using a precursor to Babel, all these things that like didn't exist outside of Facebook at all. But he was like, hey, I built this like thing where you can create a program that like figures out AST nodes in like a file. And then you can tell it to transform them into something else and reprint them with the same code style. So that was even before Prettier. And that like actually that library was also built by somebody else together with Felix, where it's now the core part of Prettier, which is like, it goes back so far, it's crazy. But then he was like, I built this thing, it's kind of cool. And he kept it on his like development server, and was like, I had to like go to him and like force him to give it to me. He was like, I'm not going to give this to anyone. And so I was like, give it to me. This is amazing. This is exactly what I need. And then over the course of one night, I actually did like, I stayed at the office, I slept at the office. And over the course of one night, I built this code mod. It was like 1,000 lines of code, and I wrote it from top to bottom. They would take this Relay GraphQL mix-in and like for each component and turn that component into something that was wrapped by this higher order component. And then I ran it on the whole code base, and it just transformed everything. And so that's how we like popularized code mods.
So you mentioned that you felt that React was mostly done, and that's not so interesting for you. So how was the transition to Jest from these projects?
Just to be clear, I feel like it's if I feel like it was done, that doesn't necessarily mean it's actually done, right? Like React has evolved a lot over the last 10 years, and it's going to continue to evolve. The team is doing a lot of amazing work. It's mostly for me, it just didn't feel like that's where I want to spend my time, and that's totally has nothing to do with React. It's a completely personal, like subjective thing where I'm like, okay, I feel like this is done, or I don't see the impact here. Maybe I was too early in my career where I was like, I just wasn't that interested. So this is not something like, digging at React or something. Like it was just my personal like choice. And for Jest, that was interesting. So I mentioned, I was kind of just going on, and I'm so excited still, like thinking back. I know it's so long ago, but that's why I keep talking, because like it felt like such a magical time where so much in the JS space was still being invented. And like being at Facebook at the time, it was still like the underdog. Yes, it was a large, big tech company, but in the JS world, especially in open source, when React was open source, it was something where everybody was like, what is this? And nobody like understood it. Maybe that presentation to introduce it wasn't great, or maybe the tweets quoting it, they were like kind of misrepresenting it. But it took months for people to figure out, okay, this is actually pretty good. And so it felt like, okay, Facebook was ahead of its time. And the challenge wasn't just to build those things, but also to explain everyone to why like this way of developing is better. And so for me, it was like I was working on this JS code shift stuff and like all these code mods. And so after I worked on like Relay and like this product where we were trying to rewrite Facebook.com for mobile using these new technologies, I was like, okay, Relay is kind of cool and it's like kind of fun to work on, but now I got this superpower where I can change like 1,000 files with like, the click of a button, and I just transformed the entire code base in Facebook, like to get rid of old patterns and like, just like make it like upgrade the entire code base. And in a way, this doesn't really have any impact. It's more like, hey, subjectively, I think we should all be on the modern and latest version of JS. And I think, it prevents bugs and like, there are reasons like it's like less code to read or it's more consistent. There's like probably 100 reasons I can come up with why that matters. But in the end, it wasn't like super impactful or wasn't seen as super impactful. So my manager at the time, Tom, he came to me and was like, hey, how about you work on Jest? Because it was open sourced and then abandoned. And people really kind of hate working with it. And also at Facebook, it was breaking down and it was slow and didn't have the features we needed. So how about you work on Jest? And because it had this poor reputation internally and externally, I just said no. I said, I'm not going to touch this. I'm not going to work on it. It's horrible. What am I going to do on this? But I slept over it and then started looking into it. And I realized, okay, we have to rewrite this, but the core ideas in Jest are really, really good.
So how did you decide where to start? I can imagine if a project is in a really bad shape, there are so many important decisions you are making at the very beginning. How did you go about it?
It was important to recognize whether it has to be rewritten from scratch, or like whether we would have to rewrite something completely different, like build a new system and then migrate everything else over, or whether there's a way to rewrite it from scratch but incrementally so that we can bring everyone along. And when I realized that, then it started becoming really obvious that we just cannot like build a new testing framework. There's no way we can motivate engineers at Facebook to like rewrite tests to another system or something like that. And so what I came up with was to like split up Jest into different pieces, and I think it turned out to be like 30 different like modules. And that's also when Sebastian Mackenzie and I were working together, and he mostly came up with this idea of workspaces that I immediately adopted in Jest. And like it was like one of the first kind of JS projects that adopted this monorepo idea, where you take this one project and take all the code and split it up into like different packages. And that allowed me to really solidify, hey, what are all the pieces, the core technology in Jest that is like super useful, maybe even outside of Jest, because like we started using parts of Jest in like individual one-off tools at Facebook, but also in like React Native's bundler, Metro. And so once I pulled everything apart, I started incrementally rewriting various pieces. And like often these like were hand in hand. I would like look at a piece and I'm like, okay, I can isolate this, take it out, and then rewrite it in place. And then, make it like 10 times or sometimes even 100 times faster. Because the way it was written at the time was like, okay, it works really well for like 100 tests maybe, and for like this size of the code base. But then Facebook was growing astronomically, year over year in terms of the code base size, like where the tools break down just because of how many files there are, how many lines of code there are. And so just reimagining Jest in like the modern way, and modern in this time in this point of time, which was 2015, and just rewriting it to keep up with the growth of the code base at Facebook, that just led to 10x or 100x improvements over like all the access that we cared about. And we were able to like take something that kind of sucked, or was like honestly just really terrible, and make it into like the best way to test your JavaScript code.
I like it, making prioritization based on a rule of thumb, whether the increase would be 10x or 100x compared to maybe 10%. Must be energizing to work on such a project where each change can have such a profound impact. How did you monitor whether the community is responding to it outside of Facebook? Maybe you mentioned that there was a lot of hate for the project. How How did you manage to convince the community they should give it another try?
For the first 6 months or so, I just shut that out almost completely because the project was so broken that talking to anyone outside there was no value in it. It was impossible to get any contributors. It was impossible to get anyone to adopt it. And it was also not a good time for anyone to adopt it because I was making breaking changes all the time. So one thing maybe for MooTools also that like just looking back at that, like another thing we kind of did wrong is because we were so idealistic about it. Every single patch release, and we weren't following Semware. Nobody was following Semware at the time, really. Every single patch release had like major breaking changes that would like take sometimes, it was kind of still Wild West. There was no type checking, nothing. So, you might upgrade your JS framework and everything breaks and you don't know why. And it might take you like a week to upgrade your JS code, right? And so we just didn't care because we upgraded our own things. And so that was definitely a mistake that all the people that then ended up at Facebook learned from were like, for example, React hasn't made breaking changes in like years. And even if there's like things that are deprecated, it will still be supported by splitting it out into like a separate module or something. And for me, similarly, when I was working on Jest, I really took that to heart. So I made breaking changes to Jest in every major release. And at the time I was shipping a major release every like month or maybe even 2 or 3 weeks. But I made breaking changes in the way where it's like, hey, this thing is not deprecated. The next release, that's going to go away. Or here's a code mod where you can upgrade your code base automatically. Or, here's like a separate package you can keep using, so that anybody who was using Jest in open source could like continue to like continue to use it and be brought with me on like this journey to like rewrite the framework, to the latest and best version. And then it was like 9 months or so later, or like a year after I started working on it, where I thought, okay, what we have now, people at Facebook are liking it. People are writing a lot of tests. You can see it in the metrics that, code is tested much more, less more test coverage, whatever. And then the year later, it was when Facebook also created Create React App. That was an interesting open source project because nobody really knew how to use React outside of Facebook. Or, there were different patterns and people could figure it out, but it wasn't maybe ideal. And the interesting thing is that at a company like Facebook, where you have a team like that's working on React or on Jest, those teams are responsible for maintaining the setup. And there's also a mono repo, so you only set it up one time. So as an engineer, even working on Jest, I had no idea of how hard it would be to set up Jest, right? So one thing to make it good in open source was like, make it zero config. So you like npm install Jest and it would like, you literally run the command and it works, right? Nowadays, unfortunately, the configuration has become much more complex. I wish people could maybe redo the config system and like bring it to a new level of like zero config again to like optimize it and make it easier to set up. But basically, we did all these things for open source. And then it came to people pushing me to actually add Jest to Create React App. And I also, like, again, had this strong reaction where I said, no, I don't want to do it because it's not good enough yet. There's still like maybe a year of development until it's actually really good. But Dan Abramov pushed me and some other folks pushed me to do it. So I added like I created a PR to like be like, hey, here's what it might look like to add Jest to Create React App. And then there was a huge amount of pushback from the community. And I still remember the issue number on Create React App is 250 because, that was like one of the instrumental moments for Jest's history where you can really see that it like had this hockey stick growth from that moment on, where people were really pushing back. And I said, I'm okay. I didn't want to do this, but I explained, hey, here are the reasons why Jest is different now compared to what you might have used in the past. And, I explained that we had staffing, we had people, who really dedicated to it at Facebook, but also in open source, that we rewrote everything, that it's really fast, that it has like the best APIs for testing now. And that, in short, it's like at the time that it is the best test runner that's going to be continued to be supported. And then people were like, okay, all right, let's give this a try. And everybody really started loving it. And so I think that's really the turning point. It's sometime in 2015 or 16.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned that you kind of shut down all the feedback or all the communication with the community at the beginning. Were there some hard times during your work on Jest when you really felt discouraged by anybody or any messaging from the community, or how your contributions were perceived?
Honestly, no, I really didn't care, to be honest, because I knew what I was doing and I wasn't focusing on making Jest great in open source at the time. It was just not really like something that was like an issue day to day, you know. I knew the project wasn't in a good state. If somebody said something, I knew it wasn't like reflecting on like my ability to like change it. And I had like pretty clear goals in mind of how I had to change it at Facebook. You know, it doesn't matter what somebody says who doesn't have any insight into like Facebook when I'm sitting there and making the test framework literally 60 times faster for like running tests at Facebook. You know, like that's like the only thing that mattered to me. And, you know, again, like I was kind of pushing back on like making it a bigger deal in open source at the time because I just thought it wasn't ready at that time. So I feel glad that, you know, with like I tried to approach it with like kindness and be like, hey, I understand your concerns. I'm listening to them. And like, here is what's different, right? And I wasn't like emotional about it. I was like, hey, here are the data points, you know, like you can make up your own mind, you know, and like if you guys are okay with it, we can merge this and like make it the default in Create React app. But, you know, it wasn't me who was like pushing this. So I think I was just trying to be nice about it and like see what happens. And I'm glad that the community at the time accepted it.
So Create React app was basically the one that brought up Jest back into the open source community, if I understand it right.
Yeah, I would say that was one of the primary points in time where it changed, and like including it there, that really helped.
That's a good way to go about it, right? When you have some successful open source project, and kind of use that to bring out another one into the scene. Did that happen ever before or after that at Facebook?
It's hard to say. I'm pretty sure like Pretty's adoption was definitely helped by you know, being added to like Create React app or something like that. Whenever somebody pulls together like a good set of technologies into like one of these boilerplate projects, there's two things that can happen, and like I've seen both of them happen. One is the boilerplate dies because it has too much stuff in it, and like those projects are not actually good. And the other is like people are realizing, oh, this project is like really good, so I'm going to add it to my own thing as well. And so, you know, I think it's a double-edged sword. And maybe that was also part of why I hesitated of adding Jest to Create React app, because at the time there were also other testing frameworks that were being built that in some ways were better than Jest, and in some others they were worse. But I thought, if we're making that decision for the community and it's the wrong decision, then that's going to reflect poorly on us. You know, I'm glad it wasn't that way, but that was one of my concerns as well. So I think those are decisions that need to have broad consensus. Everybody needs to be on board, and you know, you need to be damn sure that it's the right move. Otherwise, it's going to kill your boilerplate eventually.
At which point did you run out of like 10x scale types of problems you can fix, and how did you prioritize the remaining things after then? And maybe at which point you reached the state where you thought, oh, it's done, it's almost done, maybe I need another challenge?
I don't think you ever run out of 10x possible improvements when you're really into like a project that you really love doing, because like a lot of these issues, like performance issues, come with scale, right? So let's say you make the project 10x faster and you're like, oh my God, I'm so amazing. Often like 10x improvements can be like early on in a project like this can be like, oh, we did something really silly here that was like synchronous and should be async, or we did something here that we never cached, you know, and then it's like 2 or 3 lines of code and it actually ends up being like, you know, let's say 2x or 5x faster, and it compounds pretty quickly. But then, you know, you run out of those like small fixes, but then the code base gets like 10x faster. So you need to make a 10x improvement to keep it at the same speed. And the only thing that really changes here is like the duration of the project. So instead of spending like a month making it a lot faster, you might spend like 6 months. But it should always be possible to like do smarter things. So one other thing is, okay, you grow the number of tests by like 100x, and maybe the change here should be that you really track, depending on which files change, which tests have to run, you know. And then the key thing here is not making those 10x improvements all the time, but finding a way to, if we're using like big O notation, like if you're running all the tests all the time, that's O of n, and like if n grows really fast, then that's really bad. So you should ideally have a complexity of like just the size of changes. So if you change one file, you only run the tests that are affected by that. If you run 10 files, only the tests that are affected by that. But you don't have to run all the tests all the time. And the great thing about that is that eventually, when you reach like a complexity of just the size of changes in, one pull request or something like that, it will ideally scale indefinitely, and then you don't have to run after these 10x wins anymore. At the same time, it was like after a year or so of working on Jest together with other folks, I tried to, I hired somebody who I convinced them to join Facebook, but then they had to join the ads team for, like priority reasons. But they really wanted to work on Jest. So I convinced them to work with me. And then he was actually working full time with me. And there were other folks who spent like a month or maybe 3 months on like just working on Jest full time with me. And I realized when they had like good career outcomes because they were working with me, that I actually enjoyed them being happy more than actually the progress on Jest that they made. Obviously that was important to me, but I just enjoyed working with people and like helping them get to certain career outcomes more. And so I realized I should probably take the next step and switch to management. And so I switched from just working on Jest and tech leading Jest to managing JS infra for all of Facebook. And that included Yarn, which was being worked on at the time, not open sourced yet. And then also Metro, the React Native bundler. It wasn't called that yet either. So I was able to like take it out of React Native and brand it as like Metro and make it its own, give it its own identity. And then also all of the rest of like JS infra at Facebook.
How does that transition from IC to management at Facebook looks like? Is there some specific process that you have to go through, or is it more of a, I want to be a manager now, and yeah, sure, we're good with that?
Ideally, your manager says, yeah, sure, like go with it. Of course, your manager makes that decision with like probably talking to other managers and their manager as well. Ideally, companies don't require an interview process. It's honestly, it doesn't make any sense for me when you work at a company for many years and you're like a successful engineer, you've shown capability to manage a team, and your manager is on board to like go through a separate interview process. It makes absolutely no sense. And any company that has that, it's just like ridiculous. And it's usually a waste of time, because the decision whether that person is going to move to management is made before they start interviewing for that process. And then you might have like your manager interviewing you for a management position on your team. Like I've actually been in a situation like that, and it absolutely makes no sense. Because your manager, if he or she is in control of that decision, there's no point in spending an hour deliberating hypothetical ideas about like whatever you might do as a manager. The manager can just like make that decision. So thankfully, Facebook is always, or at the time was always, very low friction. Everybody said, maybe it's a bit early because you haven't been at Facebook that long, so maybe it's a bit early for you to switch to management, and maybe, arguably a bad choice. But everybody was on board. And so thankfully that was pretty smooth from that perspective.
Yeah, I didn't hear too much, or I didn't see it in my life where you would internally interview for another position, basically. But I did hear about it. They happened in Facebook probably after this recent restructuring like a year ago. I think where you would have to kind of interview for a different position. So I guess they introduced it after you left.
It depends on the kind of change you're making. So it's not, I'm not aware of recent changes. I haven't been at Facebook for the past 3 years. And so usually if you're staying in the tech org and like switching from engineering to management, there weren't any interviews. But if you really change your actual role, to do something completely different, then that might be a thing. Let's say you go from engineering to PM, or from PM to engineering. That's like definitely one for sure.
Yeah.
But at companies like Facebook, the salary bands, the levels, all these things are aligned between engineering and management. So switching back and forth doesn't change your compensation or any of those things. So it's like much smoother to transition. But if you were to switch from, let's say, sales to engineering, where your salary like might like go up by 2x or 3x or something, that's when companies usually interview, because there's a lot more friction involved in like that process and verifying whether they're up to it as well.
So did you have to stop coding from day to day, or how did it look like?
I always tried to stay extremely technical. In my career, before becoming a manager and after, I always found that the managers that I had that weren't technical enough is where I really struggled, because I noticed that it's just really hard to get things done when your manager doesn't know what you're talking about. And I want to have a manager that can support me, help me grow, help me learn things, help me just get better, like somebody I look up to. That's ideally the manager that I have. And when they weren't technical enough, I just found that there's no point in working with them in a technical org. Obviously if it's like a small group and like your CEO is not technical, that's like a different setup. But at a large company, if your manager is not technical enough and you're working in an infrastructure organization that is like entirely about the tech, your product is a technology, and it's not even end user facing, then, and your manager doesn't get it, then it's just so hard to get anything done, because you cannot rely on them to, convince other like peer groups of like certain things about technology, or sell the work that the team is doing to their leadership. And so I've always found that those managers were like, 10x or 100x weaker than managers that had the technical knowledge. That doesn't mean that those managers have to write code day to day on that team, right? But they should, if you're managing like React, you should at least, have a side project where you like know how hooks work. You should like know all the intricacies of like use effect, for example, like these sort of things. Because if you're managing a technology team, you'll want to be part of the conversations and understand what problems people are running into. And that's also the only way that people will feel understood, the people that are reporting to you. And that's how you can fight for them, right? So I think for me personally, I always want a manager like that. So I also always wanted to provide that kind of support to people reporting to me. And I also pretty quickly learned that it's tough and you have to dial that in. And like, the first 1 or 2 years as a manager, I don't think I did a great job at all of those things. And it's something that I really like learned and settled over the years is, you have to approach this in a way where you don't take away the breathing room for your tech lead because, you're the most technically advanced person on the team, has been around for the longest time or something like that, and knows all the legacy systems. And you also want to be able for create a space for junior engineers to like build their own space and build up that knowledge without having the manager come in. It's like, oh, my manager knows everything better. And then they feel like you're watching over their back, right? Mm-hmm. So you have to be super technical, really get them when they're talking to you about a technical problem without being like too prescriptive and like, constraining the team because you're technically more knowledgeable or something like that. So that takes a while to learn. And some of the managers I've had in the past were just incredibly good at that. And, they wouldn't make it obvious that they know basically everything you're doing, but they would be able to ask a question to you where you start really thinking about like, maybe if I approach the problem differently, I'll, be much better at what I'm doing. And so that's the kind of manager that I want to have and who I want to be as well, to be technical, maybe write some code. Just on the other angle here, to be honest, though, is that I found in my career, and also when I took time off from big tech, is that when I don't write code, I just feel like I'm missing something. It's something I grew up with. It's something I've been doing for more than 20 years. So even when I was managing a 10-people team, I would always focus Monday to Wednesday or so on like people management related things and like the team and like making sure everybody's taken care of. But then, try to keep Thursday, Friday mostly free of meetings so I could go in and write code. And then I would usually pick problems that nobody else on the team would be blocked on, that nobody else had on their roadmaps, just so I don't get into disagreements, because you don't want to be in the spot where your manager writes shitty code, then that was me, wants to ship it fast, and like violates all the principles, but it's like, hey, this is going to make something 2x faster, and then get into arguments with the engineers on the team who feel like they cannot push back because they're the manager. So trying to set that up in a way is really challenging. But personally, I really love that sweet spot of like mostly people management, a little bit of coding, and doing things that are, helping the team rather than slowing it down and hurting them.
Have you ever put yourself as kind of that gatekeeper for code reviews? Were there moments where kind of all the code reviews had to be approved by you for whatever reason?
Oh, definitely not. Definitely not. I'm probably on the other spectrum where I'm like, hey, let's move fast and like ship it and like get it in. And if there are problems, like let's fix it later. So it was honestly the opposite problem. I mean, it's possible that I was perceived as a gatekeeper because obviously I do have high standards for like what code should be like. But that's also something you learn if you're trying to stay technical as an engineering manager. You learn when to ask, your tech lead to jump in. Like instead of me rejecting a pull request, I would ask the tech lead, hey, can you take a look at this? And then, ideally it's obvious to them why it wouldn't work. But like what actually happened quite often was that I, because I only had like Thursday, Friday to build something and I wanted to get it done quickly, that I would send it out for review and people on my team would block me. And I was proud of that because that meant I was able to create an environment on the team where they didn't feel like they couldn't speak up to me. They would like call out and be like, "Hey, Christoph, I expect more from you when you're writing code." And that's great, And for me, it was like, "Hey, I want to just get this done. I don't have much more time. So can we please ship it?" So I think we had the opposite situation much more often than the situation you described.
Before we move on to Yarn, maybe last question on this topic. Since you were so deeply involved technically and you understood everything, how did it impact kind of managing disputes? That's something that is happening very, very frequently between software engineers. There are different opinions, different ideas, and often the engineering manager kind of has to become the judge or referee. How did you go about this type of?
It really depends on whether those disagreements are contained within your team or they are spanning across teams. And when they're spanning across teams, the complexity rises. And then usually what ends up happening is that you would reach out to the manager on that team. I might have to talk to my manager who talks to the manager of that team, or, it depends on how severe it is, right? Ideally, you can solve it by just talking to that engineer directly or that manager, and then you figure out what message to send to the people reporting to you and like how to resolve that. If it's contained within one team, that's a lot easier because, it's contained and you can like deal with it on your own without anyone else having to get involved. And the best way I found to resolve issues, it doesn't make everyone happy because code can be subjective and some people just care about how perfect it is. And I think I was able, through my work on MooTools as a teenager, I was able to put that idealism behind me very early in my career, right? Where it's like, I don't care what the code looks like. Obviously there's like a really high standard at Facebook, and like that's my baseline, right? So it's not like that I don't care, but like as long as it gets to that baseline and it will scale and like it, it fits certain criteria, I don't really care which solution we end up with in the end, right? And so the thing that really matters is like you take all the emotion away, you try to like get that out of the team, you put everyone together in a conversation, and then you just put out the facts, right? And then like it's like if it's the same solution, two different people, they cannot agree on it, one of them must be factually better. If it's not, then it's like, why the hell are we arguing about the same implementation for like a system that has the same behavior, right? So that would be a problem. But like even if you do this fact-based approach, I've seen it where somebody who's more junior will go out of the room and be like super unhappy that their solution wasn't chosen, even though it was from my perspective objectively way worse. But I think a little bit of democracy, taking the emotion out, that helps. Sometimes it's also this is the thing about management. There is no one solution. There's all these management books, and it's like, here, this is what you should do, that is what you should do. But everything is so circumstantial, and you cannot just use the same approach for every single situation. You have to really know the people, not just how they work. You need to know them personally, socially. You need to like care for them to figure out, hey, how can we get the best out of the people that are working with you, that have the most impact for the company, while everyone on the team is happy and the team works well together, right? And so, maybe sometimes you need to come in and be like, we're picking the solution, done, no arguments, right? But others, it's like, oh, this is a really good opportunity for the team to learn how to make those decisions and not get into disagreements. It really depends.
So you mentioned that you kind of stepped up and you oversaw the JS tooling at Facebook. And part of that was also Yarn. Which stage was it when you kind of took it over, and how did you impact it? How do you think about future development? What were your contributions?
Very minor contributions. That's like how I look back at it. I think I was mostly acting in this engineering manager and maybe a little bit of a PM role to make sure that this project would be perceived in the right way. And there were ways in which I've hurt the project too, because I was definitely complaining about NPM at the time a lot. Not just NPM the project, but also NPM Inc., because I felt like there were many things that weren't run in the right way. I don't know if I was right or wrong. I never worked there. So, maybe it wasn't justified that I was giving feedback on Twitter of all places about how NPM Inc. wasn't running their package registry right. So I was definitely hurting the project too. Not just saying that I only had positive impact, but it was pretty early on that I was involved. At least I wasn't like really coding much on it. I did make or did add a bunch of things prior to the release, just like all hands on deck to just like make it happen. But Sebastian McKenzie, as far as I remember, he was building or involved with like analyzing this like prototype worm that like could have infected the entire NPM registry. And he came to the conclusion that NPM is just like insecure or like broken, like the package manager, not the company. And so he thought that at Facebook, we were also running into all these issues where NPM just didn't scale anymore. We had so many third-party packages. And Facebook was one of those places, to be honest, where we had the strong NIH, the not invented here syndrome, where we actually didn't have that many third-party packages in our web product, like Facebook.com or Instagram or whatever. Everything was written in-house, like, yes, maybe React was an NPM dependency, but it's also like a first-party dependency. But then on React Native, that's where the complexity came in, because React Native used a lot of third-party libraries. That's just because of the nature of the thing, where you're like building something for iOS and Android, and there's like tons of third-party stuff that we had to pull in. And then Metro and Jest, they were all built using third-party libraries as well. And so that repo was like exploding. And then it like, the CI times were like too long. CI would break. Then there was this NPM shrink wrap system that still doesn't work up to this day, where there was no log files. The concept of a log file just didn't exist. The shrink wrap in NPM just didn't work well. And so we ran into tons of like consistency issues where stuff didn't run for people. It was slow. It was broken. All these things. And so that, together with Sebastian McKenzie's findings, led him to just think, hey, I looked into NPM. There's no reason why this has to be so slow. And it was like really, really slow at the time. So, in many ways, I think Sebastian McKenzie is like an outstanding individual that like, he created Babel and Lerna and Yarn and like Rome and like many other things. But if you really look at it, and I think he would admit that on his own as well, is that when he worked on Yarn, he didn't really do anything special. He just looked at, hey, how do we install packages? How do we lay them out? How do you make those processes as fast as possible? And so he just wrote this dependency manager from scratch. So he wrote like 80% of the code to make the installs fast and safer and add log files so that it's consistent and deterministic and all that. And then there was Konstantin Raev. He was another engineer who was reporting to me, and he did what I would like to say the other 80%. So it's like 160% of the work. Maybe I did like 20% of the engineering work or something. But Konstantin was then the one who took over from Sebastian for the most part to polish the project, to make it actually like super compatible. There were like all these tons of edge cases, add a bunch of remaining commands, and like just make the project whole, that like it's like when we can open source it, that will have a lot of impact. So, I was there to guide that process to make it happen. And, it was from the beginning to, closer to like the 1.1 or like whatever the latest 1.x release was, and not super involved after that anymore.
I think we would move on to your future projects as well. But before we do that, you worked on the open source projects mostly as part of Facebook, big corporation. What are your thoughts about pros and cons when an open source project is developed by a big tech compared to indie open source projects?
Oh, in general, I would trust big tech open source way more than any indie project, mainly because if it's a project that big tech company uses, you'll know it will scale. You'll know they're probably stuck with it. You'll know that if they think they're not stuck with it and have to replace it, they'll replace it with something else that's even better. And that they'll likely have a migration strategy because they have like maybe, 10 million lines of code that depend on it. And, if you're just a small company, you don't have any of those problems. And so sticking with those open source projects means that you'll be able to go along on that journey with them. For an indie project, it's very easy to like kind of pull funding and then it's like done and nobody will ever work on it again. So just from that perspective, at the same time, there's this risk where, maybe that project that is being open sourced isn't all that it seems to be and isn't actually used that widely at that company. And, there's some big tech companies where you look at their open source projects and it's like, are they even using that internally, right? They have like 200 people working on that open source project and they're not really using it at that company. Not going to name names now. But, this is the challenge also then if you look at Facebook. And I honestly, I'm so grateful for Facebook and I love the way open source was approached, and it's mostly misunderstood in the community and it definitely put a lot of struggles on the engineers at Facebook as well. But like the way Facebook open source kind of worked is, Facebook cares about open source, but then when you're an engineer working on those open source projects, your role is not to work on the open source project, it's to solve problems for Facebook. And ideally those can be open sourced as well. The way I look at open source is that it doesn't, like, open sourcing code doesn't mean that anyone has a right to get their issues fixed. They don't have a right that it will work. I think if you're using open source projects, and everyone does, like every tech company in the world, and non-tech companies too, like everyone, the whole world runs on open source these days. But I feel like you should only use open source projects when you're prepared to like maintain them as well. So, obviously that's not super realistic, right? And like it doesn't matter as much for like large projects like React, but it does matter for small projects. So then this was also a constraint that I put on myself when I started building a company and building Athena Crisis, the video game that I'm working on, is that I only wanted to rely on open source technologies that I either fully understand or understand enough to like build a similar version if I had to. That was just a constraint that's like really silly, that doesn't make any sense, but that's the constraint I put on myself. But I think that's how you should see open source in any organization. Like, and like it shouldn't matter if it's an indie project or a big tech project. Like if you're adopting it and you're making it a core piece and a critical part of your infrastructure, you cannot rely on somebody external to be able to be there and like fix a bug in production if like you run into it, right? You have to be able to go in and understand it and make it work. And so I'm a big fan of the idea of throwing code over the wall and saying, hey, this works for us, it might work for you. But beyond that, you cannot expect us to like maintain it. We might, but like don't expect it, and so honestly, like, for all its faults, I'm a big fan of like how Facebook has been approaching things. And, I'm sure a bunch of people at Facebook would say, no, that's totally wrong. There's much more support. But in my experience on those front-end projects, it was usually the reason why they became successful in open source wasn't because Facebook wanted them to be open source. It was because certain individuals really cared about specific projects and they went way above and beyond to make them the success that they are.
In my experience, it doesn't work that way from that small company that's adopting some kind of project, open source project, right? They usually don't go into the project and do some changes that they need, right? They will wait, or they'll find out if there is some other solution to the problem or stuff like that. Is there something you would recommend for those smaller folks maybe to do and to get involved more in those solutions that they actually use at the end of the day?
Yeah, I definitely, what I just said is a more idealistic view of like, hey, you're using open source, you better understand it, right? And the only reason why I'm saying that is because if you don't, then it doesn't matter if it's open or closed source, because, you're losing control over your destiny, right? So if you use them on like some leaf nodes of your system, maybe it doesn't matter if you understand it fully or not. But if you're using something as the core technology of your system, you update that version, there's a new NPM update package version of that thing, you update it, you push it to production, and suddenly everything goes wrong and you have no idea what's going on. That doesn't matter what project you're using. It's like your fault and you're having a negative business impact, right? So that's why I'm saying that ideally you have an understanding so that you can go in and fix your own issues. For smaller companies, of course, it's not always possible. And it takes much more time to build things as well if you go this way. But it gives you more control. And if you want to start out like contributing to open source as a smaller company, the best way that I've seen is, to go in and be like, hey, here are the problems we see with this framework. Here are the bugs we ran into. Let's go and upstream some fixes for that. Because there's usually no point for like smaller indie companies or like smaller, like maybe startups to go and be like, hey, we're just going to have 3 people work on open source projects randomly full time and like solve problems that we don't even have at the company, right? Like the best way that I've seen it work both at small and big companies is that you figure out what the company needs, figure out what the open source project needs, and find a way to align them. And if you can do that, then you're solving a company problem, but it's also open source. And so it's kind of like hitting 2 birds with 1 stone.
So you need to go for specific problems that the business has.
Yeah.
That's a nice way to put it. Yeah.
So moving on, what was how was the transition from Facebook and all these open source projects to your own company? It's it's a known fact that you are now running your own company, indie gaming studio. So how did the transition look like?
Yeah, in between that and starting Nakazawa Tech, I was also at Stripe for a brief time. And I think, the way I look at it is I'm kind of taking a sabbatical from like big tech. There are so many great things. And, for example, for definitely Facebook, I'm incredibly grateful for the opportunities that I had there. But when you work at larger organizations, and to an extent smaller ones as well, and it's always culture dependent, is that you get constraints put on you, right? Like you have to follow certain goals, you have to follow certain rules. There's a certain way that performance is evaluated. You have meetings, and it feels like, you might end up in a spot where you wake up on Monday at 9 a.m. or like you start working at 9 a.m. on Monday, and your entire week is already pre-planned for you. You have meetings here, there, and you have to be like in front of your computer or in a meeting room at a certain location at a certain time. It's almost like, watching linear television. Like nobody does that anymore, right? Like it's like, you want to watch your TV series, like you show up on Wednesday every week on 8 p.m. Like that doesn't make any sense, right? And so, we all moved on to this like Netflix and streaming model. And I feel like large organizations are still very much in this like old school system of like linear television, where it's like you have to be there for this meeting and that meeting, and you spend all this time thinking about the work that you're going to do next instead of doing that work directly, right? And obviously, I understand why it is that way, and you have to communicate with people around you, and you have to do that planning to reconcile and align everyone. That totally makes sense. But after doing it for a long time, I just thought I need to have a bit of a break of that from that. I also thought that as an engineering manager at the time, obviously there's always ways to grow and go up the ladder and all that, but I felt like I hit a ceiling in terms of like raw people management, and like I didn't feel like I was excited to go further up at the time. And I wanted to go back to really become more complete as an engineer again. So I always stayed technical, but I spent so much time working in the infrastructure space. And, as a teenager, I built stuff with PHP and like JavaScript, and I knew how to deploy that with Apache and whatever. But then at big tech companies, I kind of missed the entire like cloud and like all these things, because at big tech companies, you just write code and like there's other teams taking care of how to deploy that. And like ideally you have like continuous push. You just, press a button, it goes in, it goes out, and like, 3 billion people like get that code immediately. It's like, it's insane, right? But you don't have to think about how that works. So I wanted to go back to the basics of like, okay, I spent like my teenage years building social networks and video games. So I spent 10 years working at a social networking company. So I I put a check mark into that box, but I haven't built video games for a long time. And I haven't like actively like spent time coding as much, because the 6 years before that, I was mostly an engineering manager, even though I also did some coding, but it was in this space that I was already so familiar with. And so I thought, I want to just become a much more complete engineer. And also starting a company is just such a unique experience that I wanted to experience at least once. And I learned so much in that last year since I started Nakazawa Tech. But also I learned like things that I never even looked at before. I figured out Kubernetes. Like as a front-end engineer, as an infra engineer, like a lot of it doesn't make any sense, but I figured out how to, put up my cluster with all these instances and like how to run it and how to make sure it's like somewhat fault tolerant. I learned so much about Redis to like scale WebSockets horizontally. I learned a lot more about backend stuff, and I learned how to build a video game UI, how to integrate gamepad into like a video game, how to build an Electron wrapper for my web game to ship it on Steam. And so there's like this wide variety of tech that I was able to learn. But then what I also wanted to do is actually create a game world, work with artists to create the art, to create the characters, to give them personality, to come up with a story, and then make music, make sound effects, and bring all of that together and build like a real product that I care about. That's something that I would regret not doing. And so I thought, let's do that.
That sounds like you knew maybe only 20% of you needed to do, and you had to learn really quickly the remaining 80%.
Yeah, kind of like that. And that's why I put this constraint on myself that I'm only allowed to use third-party libraries that I know really well, because that freed me up to, if I'm using a game engine, I don't know how it works. So I'm just clicking buttons and I don't really have a fundamental understanding of how things are put together. But if I use technologies that I know really well already, then I can free myself up to learn how to build all the other pieces, right? And the interesting thing that I discovered with that approach, maybe my game engine isn't that good. Maybe the game is still very basic, given that it's a single developer. But I wrote like 160,000 lines of code in the last like 2 years, one of them full time, the other one like only a few hours a day. What I learned is just, you apply yourself, you like really try to figure that out. You have this base of like all these technologies you already know, so you can really focus on what you don't know. And it turns out a lot of these problems aren't that hard. You just need to dedicate your time to it to like learn them.
So you went from basically doing one single thing, right? Let's say managing people or working on some kind of code base. And then you went into, building your own company where every day seems like completely different stuff, right? Some parts might be some programming that you don't know how to do and you have to figure out. Some days might be, about talking to some artists about new music that they need to create for you. So how would you compare these two experiences, like for you as a person? Which one would you prefer in the long term?
That's a great question because, you can only live one life, but I genuinely like both of them. So I wouldn't rule out returning to that world, even pausing like what I'm doing now and like restarting it later, because I really like doing both of them, maybe even at the same time in some sense, if that's possible. I generally always like doing more than just one thing. So that's, I think, maybe why as a people manager, I always wanted to hold on to the technical ability, because I just kind of get bored if I do the same thing all the time. So it's been great to start my own indie game studio and like work across all these dimensions, not just, the most art you do for like a tech product, like a JS Infra open source project is like a logo, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so it's fun to just step out of that and like really think about the art and like really make characters that like have a personality where like, even a small 10-year-old kid is like, oh my God, I love this person. I love this person in your game, this character. And I love how I can just switch between these things and like these roles and like be an art director one day, what you're saying, or like an engineer the other day. And the nice thing about having your own company, and that's why I feel like that's something everyone should like try at least at one point. And I think it's totally fine if companies fail. Like that's my default outcome, that it won't work out, because, that's just, I'm excited that I get to do this now, but I don't necessarily need to build this into like a super large company. I'm just here to enjoy the ride and the experience and like learn, how I can be a better engineer or better manager, or, just be a better human, or like better at working, or whatever you want it to be. And so it's just this unique experience you cannot get when you're employed somewhere. And I like how there's a lack of constraints. I think you have to be really focused. You have to have a vision that you work towards. Otherwise, it can be demoralizing. You have to just show up every day and actually do the work, because you're responsible, and so nobody's going to tell you, nobody's going to do performance evaluation for you unless you do it yourself. So you have to be there and show up. So that's a downside and upside. But then there's like no constraints, there's no meetings, there's no talk about like, planning, just because it's such a small company. And one thing that I also noticed is that it's so interesting when you work at a large organization managing a team. Every time you add more people to the team, the complexity increases. So you have, 5 people, then you have 6 people, they all talk to each other. Then you have 7, that new person talks to everyone. And then there's more and more and more meetings, and things actually get slower as you add more people, right? That's like something that's commonly known. And for Athena Crisis, one thing I did with the artists is that quite often I didn't even put them in touch with each other. And like, I just talk to them over Discord. Everything is async. There's no reason for me to meet with them, because I can review pixel art much better async when I have time, and then give specific feedback, rather than being in a synchronous meeting and be like, okay, let me pull up this thing and like stare at it for 5 minutes before I tell you what I like or don't like. But then I also kind of try to keep all the interactions one-to-one, as much of one-to-one as possible. And it's this really different thing where, as a manager of a team in a big tech company, it's like, hey, here's democracy, right? Like we try to all work together, we meet together, we talk with each other. And then in a way, like running a company like this, like I'm doing now, is like a bit of more of a dictatorship, or this one-to-one thing where I have zero communication overhead because I know exactly what I need from each person, and I go and ask them for it, and I pay them for that. They're like mostly contractors. And then they give me, that product or, that piece of art or whatever, and then I put it all together. So for me, yes, it's overhead, but then there's no drama between people. There's no communication overhead for them. They can just go and do the work. And so it's just amazing to see how effective you can actually be, even if it's such a small organization. And so the question is like, if I were to go back to a larger company, what would I want to take from this experience now that helps me and the team that I would work with be more effective then?
Yeah, there's definitely some upsides of like, every day is different. It's much more creative. But at the same time, I feel like there must be this struggle with, you decide what to do next and you need to evaluate if that was the right decision and so on, right? You're the one that is in full control, basically. Otherwise, in Facebook, it would be like the team decides what is the priority, or someone at top decides what's the priority now, right? And now it's all up to you. Do you ever struggle with that? I took a wrong turn. I should reevaluate.
Quite often it's only obvious, so like way too late, where it's like, oh, I guess I learned something and I'll do better the next time. And again, I think I'm not here to build like necessarily a really large company. I care a lot about trying to build video games in the way that we're building with web technologies, because there's so many upsides to it. There's downsides, but I think there's so many upsides that can show the gaming industry that you can actually ship much faster. You can ship with fewer bugs. You can build multiplayer experiences by default, which like often takes a really long time to retrofit into a game that didn't think about multiplayer before. And yeah, you can ship like on more platforms much faster and like have persistent game worlds and like all these sort of things where it's just obvious to do that with web technologies when you're just building forms for a software as a service. But you can also do that with games. So I care a lot about popularizing that idea that like things in the gaming industry can be done differently, and that's something that is like somewhat of the North Star. And yeah, we'll see how that works out.
I really like this approach of like, I'll just wing it and we'll see how it goes.
Well, I wouldn't say it's just winging it. There is like intense focus that I try to pursue and like a vision behind it. But day to day, like it's sometimes it's like, you don't know if you're doing the right thing. You just have to try it and then see how to improve every day. I care much more about like doing things better today than yesterday than looking back and be like, oh, that was a wrong choice. Like, what am I going to do now? Right. It's like you whatever you're doing today, you have to figure out what you're doing next. You cannot change the past.
Yeah. I feel like a lot of stories from like, starting businesses and starting startups are about, first thing you need to do or learn is making mistakes and learning from them. Like you just need to constantly make mistakes. And that's your like number one priority and number one activity, basically.
I cannot believe I'm the one who is bringing us back to technologies, but I am. So I'm pretty sure when you are building a web-based game, you must have reached the limits of the technologies, and you had to find a way around them. So can you share some light on some of the biggest technological challenges you had to solve?
Tons of them, because building games with web technologies is still in its infancy. There are game engines written with JavaScript, and you can compile like Unity games to Web GPU or WebGL at least. But I didn't want to go that route, right? As I said, I wanted to learn how to build those things so I can possibly work in this space like at a lower level, not just building games in the future. And just as somebody who hasn't directly worked in the games industry, I wanted to build this understanding of how to build video games and engines, and not just like sit on this top layer of like, oh, I'm just clicking a bunch of buttons and then I have my game, right? So that was quite different, I guess, from the approach that most people take. And so that comes with those challenges where it's like I wanted to just use the raw gamepad API that exists in web browsers rather than using a library, and like trying to bring that together. And I think the key thing is like just you have all these upsides, but then you really have to fight with performance, but also with like certain limitations in the browser. Like it's just very obvious that browsers were not meant as video game engines. They have some capabilities nowadays like that, but they're primarily meant for showing objects, right? Documents. And I think that's what people run into when they're building apps. And you're running into similar things when building games. And for me, a lot of the struggles were with re-rendering things too often. And so I'm happy to say that the game reaches like 60 FPS, 60 frames per second in almost all scenarios. But there were like issues where it would drop down to like 1 or 2 FPS, and there were like major performance issues, which I was able to overcome. But yeah, there's like a lack of support for some of those features. And like one example is also the web audio API and the audio tag, which are different things. It's just really problematic just to like play sound effects and music at the same time on all sorts of devices. There's different behaviors in Chrome, different behaviors than in Electron, where you have fewer restrictions, thankfully, so that's better. But then also different behaviors on iOS Safari, which can be quite challenging to figure out.
You don't hear that too often nowadays, that, different browsers are acting differently. It used to be a huge topic back then, but nowadays you don't hear that much.
Yeah, especially Safari. The tough thing with Safari is that it actually behaves differently on desktop, on iPhone, and on iPad. So even on iPad and iPhone, Safari is different. I haven't figured out yet if it's like the same binary or if it actually is compiled differently and behaves differently. But it's iPad OS now, right? And so previously, an iPad Safari would report as like, iOS, but now it actually reports as Mac. So if you look at the user agent, because I don't think they want iPad websites on the iPad to look like a mobile version, they want it to be the desktop version. But I noticed there are like some slight differences in behaviors in the rendering related to CSS 3D transforms. And so I had issues that, it worked perfectly fine in Chrome. It had one issue in Safari on Mac desktop, one issue on iPad in Safari, and one issue on iPhone Safari, and they were all different issues. And so that can be quite frustrating because there's very little documentation about it, and it's very hard to identify what the issue is.
Yeah, I heard the story of Safari is the new IE8. You mentioned previously that you would like to actually eventually open source some parts of your game. Which parts would that be? And is that a good business model to go about?
Great question. That the jury is still out on that one. So, through this entire conversation, I think it was pretty clear that I owe a lot to open source, but also I just love the idea of it that, you can, you open source something and the ideas that you share can transcend like the original intentions, and somebody can come along and make something better or use it to like build something amazing, And so I want Nakazawa Tech also to be at least an open core company where like the core of everything is open source. And so I'm planning on open sourcing most of Athena Crisis. So the entire core game. When you go to athenacrisis.com right now, you can actually play a demo of the game, which is the actual game that's like live in the app. The latest version of it on the website directly. And so that part, all of that, I'm going to open source. So you can actually change the game. You can add features. You can add skills to like characters. You can add new units. You can change the map editor and make it better. So I want to open source about 80 to 90% of the game without, obviously hurting its commercial viability. So it's not going to be a free game. You still have to pay for it if you want to play it. But if you want to build your own version of it, if you want to come with your own art, you want to build your own system around it, your own social network around it, be my guest. And I just want to, as I said earlier, I want the ideas that I'm implementing there to like build video games to survive. And I think there's a lot that I did that is maybe way worse than all the game engines have. Obviously the graphics is like 2D. It doesn't have 3D. It's not a graphics engine that I think will survive for long beyond this game. You can make similar games with this engine. But what I care about is like the idea of, hey, you can continuously push changes to this game and ship it in like 3 minutes. It loads in like 1 second. It has like all these social network features around it. It's, you can ship this to any platform. Those are the ideas that I want to survive. And so that's one reason why I want to open source all the technologies that I've built.
Can you imagine taking on some, maybe not code, but maybe a code as well, but mainly probably learnings into, let's say, your next Facebook, Google something job?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's the great thing about changing what you do after a while and not being stuck in one place for too long is that you learn things that will make you a more complete engineer or manager or a mix of those or hybrid of those things, and you can take that with you wherever you go.
Is there something that you would imagine using actually in like document-based applications, like
oh, absolutely, yeah. I mean,
website?
there's like tons of technology. There's a whole design system. There's like this entire system where you can actually, when you open the game, it shows you, hey, what's happening. It's like a newsfeed similar to Facebook, and you see whoever is playing the game right now, and you can like tap in and like spectate another player. So I can definitely see how other games can benefit from that as well. So maybe not necessarily just apps, but also apps. Yeah, there's a lot of technology in there that like can be shared and that can be broken out and turned into a different piece of the monorepo to be used elsewhere.
Because you mentioned dealing a lot with performance issues and performance optimizations, and there's a lot of performance issues in today's applications as well. Everyone is kind of dealing with it on the front end side because, as you said, browsers were really not built for that originally, and you can see that. So is there something maybe in the game where you actually achieving 60 FPS in the game, that knowledge is transferable to the apps?
I think definitely the knowledge, but not the code, because the code is very specific to like rendering the game, right? So there's definitely a lot of knowledge that is maybe only known by me right now, which is another reason why I want to open source it, so that I can speak more about like some of these challenges that I solve to make things fast, because a lot of these problems that I solved are related to like CSS and rendering, and those transport to any type of app built with web technologies.
Yeah, I can imagine CSS probably solves a lot of problems, like it's native, right? And by default, probably 60 FPS. So if you can manage to do it by CSS, it should kind of work on its own, right?
It should, yeah. But like if you do too much work, it will still be slow.
Yeah. I just wanted to touch on the topic of kind of open source funding. Obviously, when you were working on MooTools, I guess there was no funding. It was all kind of done for free. And then later on, you moved into Facebook, where it's all donated, right, or paid by Facebook as a company. So do you maybe have some ideas on how people nowadays or companies built around open source should approach monetization?
Yeah. It's interesting because there's a lot of criticism of Facebook's open source strategy, or, like criticism of like, hey, why is Facebook giving us something so broken? And people underappreciate the, like hundreds of millions of dollars that went into the salaries for these people over, like decades now even, to build those projects, right? And so it's, when you're talking about funding, it really depends on the type of project you're looking at, right? Like funding for a project like React is probably not that useful, because what are you funding, right? Like it's this kind of project that's driven by, at least two major companies in the space, and they are funding the engineers to improve React, which has a direct business benefit for those companies, right?
Of course, yeah. But then there are some other ones, like let's say Apollo GraphQL, where they have some kind of open source software and they have built some business around it. So that's one type of companies that are built around open source. Oh,
right, I see. So you weren't thinking specifically about like donations for individuals, more like how can a company make an open source project and also sell a service. I mean, like just going back 20 years or so, Red Hat was like the famous company that pioneered this, where they like gave away a Linux distribution for free, but then they sold services for enterprise companies on top of that. And that's the model that all the VC-funded DevTools startups are following now, where it's like we're giving away our core technology, and you can buy some services or like some support on top of that. And the jury there is still out whether that's going to work. I think for many of them, that's not going to work. I think if they provide hosting, like that's probably where a lot of the money is, right? Like they give away the core technologies, but then they have a hosting platform that runs whatever project that is much faster or better, or has some access of like where it's better than like putting it elsewhere. Some of them where it's like, hey, we literally open source all of it. And, there's often the question is like, why would we buy your service, right? So I'm honestly, well, the interesting thing here is like I'm skeptical that many of those companies will work out. I think a lot of them will probably not work out, or like even the majority, which is normal, which is like true for like most companies anyway. But at the same time, there is something to be said about the second order effects of those companies creating those technologies. Yes, the company might fail, but they might build a really successful open source technology that is used by all the other companies around them, that's helping those companies be more successful. So, I don't think that's a very uplifting story, because I'm maybe a bit cynical about it. It's just that I just haven't really seen, like, especially in the DevTools space, like a VC funded company really making it, right? Where it's like, okay, yeah, this is a slam dunk where like they're open sourcing everything and that's working for them as a business. If they have like a consumer product, that could be different, right? At the same time, I also don't think it's necessarily a good idea to keep a project like a DevTools startup project like as closed source, because it's very hard to sell those either, because there are always other open source alternatives available for free. So the open core model is one that I do generally like, where you don't open source everything, but you have like some glue code that like is valuable for your business. GitLab is like a good example of that, where you can self-host like certain things, but and it's mostly open source, but then there's still a lot of value in the system that they've built.
They sell to enterprise, but
exactly, yeah. But there's very few companies that actually fit into that mold where I really see that business model working. And there's a lot of companies that are kind of just building something that seems really cool, but it's like really questionable whether they'll be able to generate any revenue within 10 to 15 years. Which the time horizon is already so long that it like might not even matter. They might not be around that long.
So you would basically say that you would go for that model of like company needs to solve problems for their own purposes, for their own business that has nothing to do with open source. And then they need to figure out how to kind of align it with open source. And like React and Facebook, where, they put it out and now they're getting the benefit of, other people basically improving it for them.
Yeah. I mean, it's not just that. I think honestly, the contributions that a company like Meta gets from React, except for folks from Vercel or other folks that are core contributors to React that might have worked at like Meta or Facebook before, the value of those is like not nothing, but it's not like a major amount of value. It's like maybe if we ascribe like a percentage, it's like maybe 5% or 10% of the contribution. So it's great, it's nice to have. There are fewer bugs, it's definitely better for it, but that's not why a company like Facebook does it, right? For Facebook, a lot of the front-end open source projects were open sourced. One, because they're really good technologies, and two, because they worked really well for Facebook. So the thought was, if it works well at scale for Facebook, it will work well for others. But then one of the most important points was that it's a really good branding opportunity to say, hey, at Facebook, we're doing really interesting front-end work. We're building really innovative projects. And that's why, earlier on, I was so excited to talk about some of them, because it just takes me back to that time and like how much energy there was and how far ahead it felt like we were. And then when you have this like branding around the open source projects you're doing, it's very easy to hire people that want to work with or on those technologies. So this is like a second order effect. You don't do open source just to like hire people, but like you can, improve your company's branding and perception in that community that you want to hire people from. And then that's like also another second order effect of like open sourcing. You're able to attract more talent to your company.
Yes, but I also think that Facebook or Meta is kind of an exception in that space where, it worked out with React, Jest, Yarn, Relay in some way. Right, there is a lot of projects that brand of Meta was put up by all of these projects. But then there are some other companies running some other open source projects where I don't think that really worked out for them, and that people would like to kind of join the company because of the project.
Of course, there's always probably more where it doesn't work out compared to where it did work out. And I'm speaking specifically about Facebook because I was there and like I was involved with that, so I have like experience that I can speak to. But if you look from the outside, at least at Vercel, they are doing incredibly well. They're open sourcing a lot of their core technology, and they hired a lot of the people that work in this space because of how open they are and because it's exciting place to work at. Sentry is another one where almost all of their error logging core technology is open source, and they are receiving a lot of contributions, but also it's definitely a hiring funnel for them. It helps that, their products for those companies is also geared towards developers. So people are more likely to actually contribute to those projects, right? Yeah. So it really depends on what you're doing, whether this project is interesting and whether you're doing it at the right time at the right place, kind of. So yeah, there's maybe a bit of luck involved as well. And it has to be the right project.
So this was all super interesting. I really love your life journey, like from starting on indie project, going to big tech, and then starting your own company. In many ways, it's super inspirational, and I think it fulfills the purpose of our podcast to inspire people to choose their own path in their life and the importance of open source software and any other decisions that you decide to do in your life. So thank you very much, Christoph. Thank you for coming here to Prague. It was a pleasure to have you here, and I wish you good luck with releasing your game and with anything else you decide to do.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right. Ciao, ciao.
Ciao, ciao.
Yeah, we do say ciao a lot.
Yeah, that's nice. It's nice. I like it.